Hello and welcome to another episode of the Express Economist. This week we are at Vishwa Yuvak Kendra in New Delhi and we are on the sidelines of a new report on NREGA and its implementation during the COVID-19 phase. I have with me two professors from Azim Premji University who have worked on that report. We have Professor Amit Basole and Professor Rajendran Narayanan. Amit has actually two PhDs in, one is in economics from University of Massachusetts Amherst and another in neuroscience from Duke University. And he teaches economics in Azim Premji University, and one of the courses that he teaches is macroeconomics of development. And Raj has a PhD in statistics from Cornell and a master's in from IIT Bombay. And he teaches courses like politics and ethics of data and development as freedom. So it's an eclectic mix. We have from their own background a bunch who have looked at life from very different sources. And today we are here to talk about not just NREGA and what happened to India's economy during the COVID phase, but I want to pull back and ask some broader questions about India's growth model. So thank you both of you for being part of the show. First of all, Raj, I would like to ask you, can you give a brief summary of what have you found in this report? What are the main key findings and where all did you look in?
Right, so thanks Udit and thanks to Indian Express for giving us an opportunity here. This was a survey done in November, December 2021. And the survey was conducted in 8 blocks spread across 4 states, Bihar, Karnataka, Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh. And the whole idea of the survey was to understand the role played by NREGA as a safety net during the year following the national lockdown of 2020. So that was the context in which the survey was done. And we surveyed approximately 2,000 households in these 8 blocks. And the main thing that emerged as part of the survey was that despite shortcomings in NREGA, the program played a very important role of a safety net during the pandemic. So just to give you some idea about what we mean by that, as we know that there was massive income loss across the board, and in these 8 blocks, NREGA's role as compensating for the income loss ranged from about 20% to 80%, depending on the block. Now, the other thing is what people felt about NREGA as a program in that area. So a large majority of the people said that the NREGA had played a huge role in the development of the village, overall development of the village. More than 8 out of 10 households actually indicated that NREGA should be an individual entitlement of 100 days per year as opposed to a household entitlement, which is what it is today. Now, as far as the shortcomings are concerned, the primary thing that emerged from the survey was that there's a huge demand which was not met. So what we are saying is that there are 2 kinds of unmet demand or rationing. On the extensive margin, which is households that wanted to work but did not get a single day of work, roughly 2 out of 5 households, they wanted to work in NREGA in the COVID year but did not get any work. And had they got work, they would have liked on an average, about 77 days of work. And then there were households which got some days of work, but on average, their unmet demand, they wanted 64 more days of work. And its implication as far as the allocation is concerned is that we did an analysis, and what we found is that the government in these 8 blocks, just on labor wages, they spent about 152 crore, whereas it should have been 474 crore, which is 3 times the budget. The government should have spent 3 times the labor budget than what they had actually spent.
Okay. So, this is a long-standing grouse, as it were, been tracking NREGA since 2005 when it was first started, that it's typically said that, the budget allocation is not enough, and that even though it's a demand-led program and everything, it does have a bearing on whether jobs are given. I want to come to the question of broader distress later on, but since you're talking about, you raised this issue, would either of you want to comment on what are the 1, 2 or 3 things that you would want immediately changed in NREGA, because NREGA has been such an important, played such an important role with so much distress. What are the 1, 2, or 3 things? One is budget allocation possibly, but what are the other 2, 3 things that you would want changed or addressed urgently?
See, one of the things is budget allocation has a direct bearing, and there is incontrovertible evidence by now that there's a direct bearing of lack of funds as far as payment delays are also concerned. And what we found is that 36% of the households only 36% of the households said that they got their wages within 15 days. So I think the twin pillars of the act, if you will, are the fact that work should be allocated within 15 days, failing which the workers are entitled to an unemployment allowance. And the second is if they don't get their wages on time, they are entitled to a delay compensation. Now, both of them are not happening. Now, as I said, one is of course the allocation of funds, and there are two other important aspects to it. One is the excessive centralization of the program, and centralization of the program through unnecessarily complicated technical architecture. So, for example, right now the funds devolution process happens through something called a National Electronic Fund Management System. So, while earlier Gram Panchayats had the power and autonomy to sanction works, and the funds were given in advance to them, but through this new National Electronic Funds Management System, which has been operational from 2016, the entire funds is now in the hands of the Government of India, the Union Government. And so the funds are transferred to the worker's account after work is completed. So Gram Panchayats don't have any autonomy, which is again, it's in violation, I won't say violation, but it hits at the heart of the 73rd Amendment. So these are definitely the unnecessary technical architecture. There's more emphasis on the technology side of things as opposed to actual program implementation.
Okay. Amit, I want to come back to the question of distress, and I'll have a question on the local Panchayati Raj governance, but I want to first understand from you. You've been tracking the distress and the state of working in India for a while now. Very recently, we had the World Bank report which said that on poverty, which said that 56 million people in India were pushed below the poverty line, and that poverty line is rupees 46 per day. That is quite an abject poverty line. It's an extreme poverty line, and 56 million people, 5.6 crores, were pushed below it. We also have unofficial data which suggests that poverty has been going up since 2011, and which stands to reason because growth has decelerated and there are those negatives with it. When you look at the overall picture, especially with relation to the economy coming out of COVID, and we talking about a V-shaped recovery, we're saying that we're back to pre-COVID levels, give us a sense of what is the level of stress in rural India or in the lower part of that K-shaped recovery.
Right. So yes, I think you're right that the last few years, even before COVID, were very hard. There was a growth slowdown happening. We don't know what happened to poverty because, as you said, the unofficial numbers, the leaked consumption rounds seem to suggest that. And recently there have been a lot of debates on what is the right way to measure it in the absence of data and so forth. But stepping beyond all those issues, I think it's fair to say that there is a contrast that we are living through maybe in the last 10 years or so with the 10 years prior to it. In terms of the growth story, the aspirational story, how well people think they are doing or how they feel about how things are going and so on. And there are many reasons for that, including some of which are legacy problems of what went wrong during the boom years also.
True.
And you also have written about that. So without going into all of those things, the challenge before us now is the COVID shock has come on top of ongoing structural weaknesses in the Indian economy. The shock may work itself out, you may get some sort of return to trend of some kind, but that trend is not a healthy one.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. How do you address those issues that were there before COVID? And the other is, how do you address the buildup of debt and other kinds of stock of bads that have been built up during COVID? There's a learning deficit that has arisen, people are more in debt, people have switched occupations to lower paying ones. Has that knocked them off permanently into a different trajectory? or are they going to go back to where they were? We don't know answers to any of these things. So policy today has a short-term goal, which is to redress a lot of the suffering that COVID saw, and the long-term goal, which is how are we going to correct for these structural weaknesses. And I think NREGA, incidentally, maybe we'll come back to this, has a role to play in both of those.
Okay.
We can talk about that.
Okay. So, I wanted to take time and speak not just about NREGA, because, we've been talking about NREGA for a while, and it's a polarizing scheme. Even the current government, berated it before it came to office, but never really did anything about it. It's not as if they scrapped it. And frankly, every time the economy is in distress, the first scheme to go to is NREGA, apart from, say, giving dry rations, and both of which we are doing. Now, the question in my mind is not so much just about NREGA, but I wanted to ask them also about why do we continue to need NREGA? Is this, this surely cannot be the solution to the distress in an economy of our size. So I want to ask two broad questions about India's growth model. One is about what, Raj, you talked about the local self-government and how we govern ourselves at the local level, whether it's urban or rural. And now we are talking also about rural employment guarantee. So, it's a question mark of whether we have the local solutions to it or not. And then I want to further pull back and ask the larger growth strategy that India is employing. So, first of all, if, either of you can take a stab at it, on the local self-government, especially in rural areas. This was, in spirit at least, was very much a part of what NREGA was hoping to achieve. When you look at NREGA data or you've traveled to it, what ails with the way we govern ourselves at the local level?
Okay, so there are many things, and see, again, ultimately, if you think about it, it boils down to power, autonomy, and when I say autonomy, I also mean financial autonomy, to be able to govern yourself. Now, there are 29 different things that are part of the state list, which are part as per the whole governance system that comes under the Panchayat Raj system. However, what is happening is state finance commissions are practically inactive in many places. Consequently, the Panchayat Raj institution on the ground, which is in the villages, they do not have that kind of financial autonomy to take decisions and do something. The second thing is that ward members, now absolute decentralized unit of governance is not just the sarpanch, but also the ward members. Now, there are no clear guidelines on what kind of things the ward members can do, cannot do. Their remuneration, their honorarium is extremely low. Even the honorarium for sarpanches are very, very low. So that is on the, as far as State Finance Commission and their power and autonomy to do something on the ground is concerned. And so they are entirely dependent on the Central Finance Commission for any kind of funding support and to do anything. So in many places, they are actually working as an outpost of the block level administration. So that is obviously going to have a negative impact on what they can do. Another important aspect is that there is something called the PESA, right? Panchayat extension to scheduled areas, which is, there is provision as part of the constitution for people in the Adivasi areas, the 5th scheduled areas, to have their own local governance system. Now, that has been dysfunctional in practically most places. So PESA is not functioning well. Ward members do not have the kind of freedom, flexibility, and even the salary to do what they want to do. And also the states haven't played much role in enacting the guidelines on what can be done for the ward members. And even the Panchayat Samiti and the Zilla Parishad, which are again the units of operation on the ground, they are also not functioning actively.
So are you saying that there are not enough laws, or the laws exist but don't get actually enforced? Or is that?
See, the thing is, I can make you live, but if I just strangle you every day and just give you enough food that you subsist, that's not going to live. There is a difference between subsistence and existence, right? Living. There's a difference between subsistence and living. So as far as the laws are there, but if I strangle you, you won't live for long.
For example, I wonder whether financial autonomy you mentioned, why does everything have to be, I mean, you've done a lot of research and we keep reading in media a lot of stories about everything going back to what the central government said, for everything on NREGA. Why can there be no local solutions to this? That can locals not figure out, can certain revenue streams not be provided at a local level? Is that a solution? Is that even workable, possible?
Revenue streams, but where does the local, now again, even the taxation policy, if you think about it, where does the money, where is the money in the hands of the locals to do anything that they want to do, right? So, and we are talking about the 29 things range from agriculture to construction of roads to fisheries.
And this is just one of them.
NREGA is just one of them.
Amit, I want to ask you about the broader growth model. Now, in the recent past, we've seen, very famously, President Biden saying that trickle-down economics doesn't work. And this is happening in US, where per capita incomes are, maybe 20, 30 times India's. In UK, we are seeing the government intervening and saying we will not, allow, we will protect you from surging prices. This is very typically a third world country response. When India would put caps on prices, many of us, me included, might be writing, this is bad policy, this is not how you should run an economy, prices should dictate. But when it comes to the crunch moment, we are seeing that even in richer economies, well-established economies like UK and US, they want more government, they want the government to do certain things. So obviously the case is not so much that government should, maybe make soaps or run tourism bungalows, but there are definitely areas where you need government, and more so for a country like India. However, when you look at the growth model that we are sort of following right now, and more particularly since 2019, is the basic idea is that we will allow the private sector to grow, invest, and they will create jobs, and through that we will have prosperity. Now, on paper, either of the model works. But do you see there's some, when you look at India's growth model, is it just spewing millions into a state where they need to be given some NREGA or we are giving 800 million people dry rations, right? And we still talk about poverty numbers. I mean, it should be an open shut case. If you're giving 800 million people of your own country basic dal and chawal, there must be poverty. So what do you think, if you could reflect a bit about the way we are approaching our growth, and does it need any reconsideration? Amit first,
Yeah. This is, of course, the big question, right? Big policy question here, and a political question also. So let me maybe say a few things in the span of time, just to make it sharp and connect it to NREGA, and go back to the government issue that you started your question with. So there are two things that even economists who are trickle downers and so on would say is a legitimate function of government. That is the provisioning of public goods and a safety net in case of fluctuations. Right? These are well-established things that governments are supposed to do. And incidentally, NREGA does both of these. That is exactly the point of NREGA, to produce public goods at the local level and to give some sort of a safety net when you don't have any other source of employment. And insofar as these two functions go, I think it's actually a good program that should stay. I don't see within the framework of a capitalist economy that you're not going to have the need for such safety nets, or that you're going to not have the need for public goods creation and maintenance. Where I think you're coming from when you say how long will we have NREGA is when it becomes sort of the default mode of employment, and there is no other non-farm employment to speak about.
Exactly.
That's not a situation we want, and that's a failure of structural transformation. So when we have enough non-farm opportunities in the rural areas, or at least in the surrounding areas, people will not want NREGA. By design, it is a self-targeting program where people only go if there's nothing else. And we saw this also in our survey, we see it elsewhere too, that the wage rates are low. Now, wherever there is private employment that exceeds those wage rates, people do the private work. So, to create public goods, to provide a safety net, absolutely NREGA has a role. I think it will continue to have a role. Then to come back to where is the failure? The failure of policy is in the lack of structural transformation. And now we have enough evidence, we have about 30 years of evidence in India's case, that targeting growth may give you growth for some time. There is no guarantee that it will give you a transformation of an economy where the vast majority are pulled up, either out of poverty, or poverty is a low bar, into prosperity, which is really what you want. To do that, growth is not enough. And not only is growth not enough to do that, but growth cannot be sustained without it either. So you get episodic growth process, it goes away. That's what we've seen. And we don't know anymore if the 2000s growth period is coming back or not. Once the base effect of COVID is gone, we don't know. So the failure of policy is to focus on growth to the detriment of structural transformation. So the question becomes, what are those policies that deliver that transformation, which, if it is successful, NREGA is automatically not relevant anymore.
So,
if I may just add to that, I think from the government's perspective, let's say there are three broad themes in which this needs to be approached. There is the constitutional imperative that there is a right to equality, right to better livelihood, etc., right to live with dignity. There's a constitutional imperative. Then there's a legal imperative. Legal imperative says, okay, everyone needs to be given a minimum level of wages and minimum level of social protection. And these are there in our legal system as well. And the third is, just to add on to that, the economic angle to all this. And there is enough evidence also. In fact, I was referring to an IMF paper, no less, from 2015, which says that if the income share of the bottom 20% is increased by 1 unit, then in the medium to long term, you see an increase in the GDP. Whereas if you focus on the increase in income of the top 1% and ignore the bottom 20%, then what you're looking at is a decrease in the GDP in the medium to long term. So I think all these three angles need to be considered when you're thinking of a program like NREGA or other social protection measures.
No, I want to just, before I close out, stress more on the bit that you said, policies haven't really brought about that structural transformation. And we've seen this right across our growths, even during, say, the high growth phase in 2004 to 8, it was called a jobless growth, and the evidence was there. And even today, in the last year, we grew at almost 9%, and Indian Express did some research on the biggest companies by market capitalization, both in the public sector and the private sector, and broadly the employment had actually contracted overall, barring a few places. So the point is that you can grow at 8 or 9% in India and still employment may not be generated. And this is what I'm trying to understand. We have a dearth of, say, health workers. Education is an issue, and I was looking at very recently how China removed its poverty. They got rid of almost 2 crore people every year for 40 years. That's the scale at which they removed extreme poverty between 1980 and 2020. And one of the things that they said was that even in the phase when there was massive poverty, they were investing in health and education. And that is why when they opened up the economy, they could actually leapfrog. So what I'm asking both of you is that, are we missing out on some key ingredients? Is it just a matter of one more policy, one more lovely sounding policy, right? Or implementation? Because, we are seeing exasperation from the government when the finance minister recently said, asking the private sector, why aren't you investing? And she referred to Hanuman and why isn't Hanuman flying? We've also seen recently RSS getting very bothered about unemployment, poverty, and inequalities. So that was the first really acknowledgement within the establishment to say that, well, there is perhaps a significant degree of distress on these factors. So, are we fundamentally approaching it in the wrong manner given who we are as a country? That is my question. Any other stab that you would want to take?
Well, this is a big question. I think that an important thing perhaps we haven't admitted to ourselves sufficiently is that thinking of ourselves as one country where all of us succeed or fail or live or die by what happens to somebody else. We haven't actually, I think, acted as if we believe it.
Fraternity.
That constitutional principle, and even a country like China, many of these other countries which are successful examples of capitalism, the private entrepreneurship and prosperity comes on the back of a strong investment in public goods, public services, and so forth, which creates a sense of collective and a platform on which things can be built. Not that inequality doesn't exist, or all of these countries are unequal countries, but there is something of a shared sense of belonging in a place. Right? And that shows up in many different ways. So our neglect of health and education, our abysmal record on public goods, and the dramatic diversions that you see between the quality of private goods and public goods. Right? The way I explain this to my students is, you look at malls and motorcycles, and then you look at drains and schools, and you'll see the stark difference. Right? So we have sort of conned ourselves into thinking.
Can you just elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah. So you've got the money, you can purchase the best motorcycles and go to the best malls. But to go to that mall, you'll still have to get all the ditches on the way and spray water of everywhere to get there. Right? Your private car could be whatever it is, but it's going to drown.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Gurgaon is a good example of.
We saw that in Bangalore.
We saw it in Bangalore recently. Right? So your Mercedes is going to drown just as somebody's cycle is going to drown. That is not that hard to get. Now, whether you blame it on caste mentality, you blame it on whatever your favorite thing is, we seem to not have inculcated that. And without that, I don't think structural transformation is possible either, because it depends on what you said, broad-based investments in the last person, right? And we haven't done that.
I mean, I think he said it exactly. I think he said it in very good words. But just to add, I think even completely divorce everything from an ethical or a constitutional perspective, even just looking at the fact that you need a healthy, well-nourished workforce to be able to contribute incrementally to an economy. Now, if I'm creating this kind of unequal turf, where one set of people who are going through their entire life not having to deal with 80-90% of the population, and 80-90% of the population is constantly fighting for day-to-day survival as opposed to any kind of mental, intellectual nourishment and bodily nourishment through good food and nutritious food. So how are we creating who is going to work? Who is going to contribute to your economy in a progressive, in an intelligent, in a good way? That's not going to happen. And you talked about jobless growth, and the flip side is, can you have growth without jobs? Right? So that's something that scholars like
sustainable at least.
Yeah, scholars like Gulapre Balakrishnan have argued extensively about.
Yeah. Right. Thanks a lot, both of you, for sparing your time. I hope the point of this episode was not just to look at the impact of MGNREGA during COVID, but also perhaps leave you with a certain sense of pause about the extreme distress that is there in the country. It is not always officially recognized, but thankfully there is some recognition now from people in RSS to say that there is mass unemployment and poverty, and they should be treated like demons to be slayed. It is very important for us to understand the number of poor people that we might have living in abject poverty might be more than most big countries, the population of big countries. And we, by our own admission, are giving, food and, relief to millions upon millions of Indians. But there has to be a systemic solution to this. While, as Amit said, that, these can exist, these are not the solution to a prosperous country. So with that, on that note, we'll finish the episode. Thanks for watching. If you liked the episode, please press like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.